Today we are talking about the United States and their participation and involvement in World War One. Sometimes call it the First World War, many times called the actual Great War. Now, World War One and World War Two can kind of be misconstrued and confused. So obviously one comes before two, but think on it also that this being the first major international war fought on multiple continents in modern history, it really sets the stage for a lot of what World War II is also going to deal with, because it ends in such a way that no one really feels like anything was actually solved. And sure enough, there was very little thing actually solved with this particular incident in history. So at the end of the First World War, we still have issues with colonialism. We still have issues with what are we doing with the Jewish populations. We still have issues with who's paying what money to what people. We still have issues with ideas of nationalism. Nothing really gets solved by this massive conflict, and that is going to create more problems down the road, which I would argue is why World War II is kind of inevitable and bound to happen. So on these posters here that we see, on the left, we see, and I'll read it to you, the "Destroy this mad brute, enlist in the U.S. Army." What we see here, and if you can't tell from the actual helmet the guy's wearing, this is a German picture of it. So this is for American, or even could be a British propaganda, but it's American. In this case, this is a German monkey who is holding his stick. He is tearing up all the city behind him if you look in the background. And he's stolen Lady Liberty. And she's so ashamed. She's just completely ashamed. She's like, I have failed my people. I have failed the world, so on and so forth. That's kind of what propaganda can do. It makes you think a certain way that is more in line with what whoever is controlling the propaganda, wants you to think. On the right, we also see, in this case, the Boys and Girls Club. And Uncle Sam is on here telling them, hey guys, I know you don't have full-time jobs yet, but, maybe y'all could help out the war effort. And y'all can help out the war effort by, buying, in this case, different war bonds and stamps. Everyone can participate. Understand wars are expensive, freakishly expensive. So to actually pay for the war and pay for the soldiers, the ammunition, the life insurance, so on and so forth, all the expenses tied in with actually having a war, you're talking in the millions, and nowadays in the billions, and in the very near future, we're talking in the trillions. And that's just how things are going with actual money spent. So what Uncle Sam is trying to do here is get all parts of the country on board with the idea of helping out the war effort however you can. You would see in the world wars rationing, propaganda, of course, like we see here, ideas on conserving things, and even making your own gardens, because if you think on it, it's not necessarily a bad idea or maligned idea, but it's the notion that if you can actually grow your own, say, corn and green beans, well, that just means the big farmers can take their corn and their green beans and ship it directly to Europe to help out with the war effort, feed the troops. So there's a lot of well-intentioned ideas associated with all this. And there's also, if you really read into it, this kind of propaganda, this would not be very well accepted in 2020, would it? If you're really honest with yourself on looking at it. If we had, say, a teacher trying to indoctrinate kids with this kind of a message, be like, hey guys, y'all should take your money that you were going to spend at school lunch today and go buy a stamp where 50% of the profit goes to the military. People would really shun that and look down on it. So propaganda is a way of influencing opinions and influencing discussions and inspiring support from whatever people you're trying to propagandize. So the First World War itself, the Great War, is going to be fought between dozens of countries. The principal few we're going to go over here very quickly. And this is going to take place as armed conflict from 1914 in the late summer through 1918. And a peace treaty would finally be signed in 1919 called the Versailles Peace Treaty of 1919. What a great name for it. So why does this war actually start? This guy here, this is essentially, my title for him is the Crown Prince. He is the Archduke of Austria-Hungary. His name is Franz Ferdinand, and his wife next to him, Sophie, well, he is going to get assassinated here in the middle of the summer of 1914 by a little terrorist organization and this one guy, and there's a really fantastic story I'll cover with it real quick. Had the driver actually stuck to the original pathing, the assassination could not have been carried out. Because it turns out Gavrilo Princip, I think is how you say his name, he actually was in the wrong position. And as it turns out, the driver took a wrong turn while doing his parade with the Archduke and his wife in tow as well. And there you go. The assassin's bullet's able to shoot and carry out his mission for assassination. This is the short-term cause. This is the immediate cause that really sparks the Great War. Some of the long-term causes of it are pretty easy to remember. We have what we call the main causes. So under militarism is this notion of course, with the root word being military, is having large armies. And I would argue that leads to war, because who's going to build up a gigantic army and not have any intention of using it? You know, like even with your neighbors on a more local level, if you see a guy like stacking up a whole bunch of fireworks, like he probably intends to blow them up, right? It's just put two and two together, and you know, if you have a big army, you're probably wanting to use it or willing to use it. Alliance systems. Now, this can get kind of tricky because some alliances are open and well known. Some alliances, especially some of the military alliances, were not publicly known. And there would actually be people pretty high up in certain governments who were not altogether aware that their diplomats had actually established, or even like their predecessors, the guys who were in charge before them, even knew, they had no idea that there were actually military alliances between certain countries. So we see this cascade, if you will, fall that leads to like a massive outbreak. What should have really been a war between some of the Balkan region versus Austria-Hungary, because they have a grief on, you know, like we want independence and blah, blah. So it's another revolutionary war for them. It becomes an international incident because of these entangling and sometimes secret alliances. Now, imperialism, to kind of keep it very simple, imperialism is simply a notion that there's one party exerting influence or control, outright control, over another. And what that can mean for some circumstances can be pretty mild. American imperialism strived to be a little softer on things, if you recall, and we would actually like try to build up economies and put money into economies of the places that we would take over or try to control, and you know, had mixed results, but overall the general feeling of it was imperialism is imperialism, and imperialism sucks, especially if you are on the wrong end of the actual relationship there. So, you know, there's really no justification for it in my mind, but you reach your own opinion on it. So in this case, imperialism, I feel, leads to this conflict that becomes this international World War I, because if you're sitting there as, let's say, a European empire, and you and some of your other empires are picking and choosing different parts of Africa and Asia to control and exert influence over and milk them of their natural resources, eventually all the land is going to be claimed. Make sense to you? You know, it's all eventually going to be taken over by somebody, or at least somebody's going to say, this is my land, my territory. And unfortunately, what that means is once all the land is claimed, now the next stage of imperialistic expansion takes hold. What this means to me, and try to follow my thought process on this, is that once all the best land is taken, now those who feel like it should be theirs, or they have a stronger army, or they have more nationalistic fervor or something, they're now going to compete over the best land, which means warfare. And the age of European modern imperialism most certainly has a lot of small wars that leads, I feel, to right here, this Great War. So imperialism, to me, once again, inevitably leads to massive conflict. And lastly, for the main acronym here, MAIN, nationalism. Now, nationalism, I would argue, can be a cause of just about anything between two countries or more than two countries. And at the root of it, nationalism is not necessarily a bad thing. Let me explain. If you feel proud of your people, let's say you were a Latino American, your family had gone through a lot of struggle and strife and 2 generations to come to the United States or to any country for that matter. And you felt that, 3 or 4 times a year, your family gets together and you'll talk about, your family traditions, your culture, you eat the food that's native to your country or some unique recipe that your family has, perfected over the years. There's nothing wrong, in my mind, with that. Be proud of your culture. Be proud of your people, your nation, because a nation is a group of people with similar different traits, similar traits, and similar shared values and cultures. There's nothing wrong with that in my mind. It can become dangerous, however, when nationalism becomes super or even ultra nationalist, and you start thinking that not only is my people great and worth being proud of, but my people, my way of doing things, and my way of thinking is superior to some other nation. And that type of nationalism was very, very much believed and loved by a lot of European countries at this time. So, like I say, nationalism by itself, not necessarily a bad thing, but super nationalism, when you actually start saying that we are superior to them, it kind of makes you underestimate the perceived enemy. To kind of go back to militarism, because I kind of skipped over this in my notes here, unfortunately, I apologize. Another aspect of militarism is not just building up militaries, but also in the schools, in society. This building up and this kind of like putting those who serve in the military on a higher pedestal than anyone else, making the youth believe that military service is the highest level of achievement and anything that you can do on behalf of your country. This became very prominent, especially in the 25, 30 years leading up to the outbreak of World War I within European countries. Now, like I say, on the surface, it's not necessarily a bad thing, but you can kind of see how when these four items combine, and then the assassination of an archduke of one of the larger empires of the time, it leads to this massive outbreak of war. All right, so to break it down, short-term cause, assassination. Long-term cause, MAIN. All right, now who's going to be involved? There are two major alliances here, and I don't want to confuse you with the actual names of them, the Triple Entente, the Triple Alliance. For your purposes, what I'm going to call them is the Central Powers and the Allies. And, for lack of a better term, the Central Powers are kind of like the bad guys in this war. These are those who align with Germany. This would include the North African and today's Near East and Middle Eastern state of the Ottoman Empire. So we have basically, if you look at a map of Europe, which we have here in a little bit, these are the countries that go down the center of Europe and then kind of like tag on also the Ottoman Turks. Okay. The Allied powers begin with Russia and France. Great Britain joins in. Italy will join in, kind of like flip-flop here and there. And then Japan. And a lot of folks, when you look and you think of World War I, you don't really associate Japan as being that big of a player because, they're so far over. They're in the Pacific Ocean, right? They're far away from Europe. Regardless of that, they actually put a lot of money in, a lot of troops in, and especially a lot of naval vessels. This was Japan's, if you look at their history, 60 to 70 years of development from what we would consider to be a middle-aged society. Middle-aged society, to kind of clarify. I mean, like feudalism and whatnot, and lords and ladies and such. That was their society in the 1850s. And here by even like 1903 to 1905, when they actually won a war against Russia, they have developed into a modern imperial power. That happened really fast. So Japan is kind of like the United States in that, they're tired of being treated and thought of as a lesser world power. They're great in their own right, and they're proving that. Because, let's face it, no other country has successfully invaded and won a war against Russia, except for Japan in 1904 and 1905. Now, the United States will join in 1917, 3 years after the warfare starts, because, we're cool like that. But Russia is going to leave the war in 1917. And let's get into that. So here is what the map actually looks like of Europe in 1914 at the outbreak of war. We have the Triple Alliance, the so-called Central Powers, versus the Triple Entente. These is Russia, France, and Great Britain, kind of allied together in their little Triple Entendre there. So if you look at the map very closely here, let me put up my little pointer. The German states, these are the German-speaking folk. Italy joins in with them for a while, and then also the Ottomans down here in north and the eastern part of Africa and the Middle East. they're right in the middle. So they're pincered, they're trapped. They are surrounded by this massive Russian army in the east and a really large army of the French and the British in the west. So Germany kind of gets involved in a war which they probably didn't really want, but they're going to put up with it and do the best they can with it. But they're going to be fighting on two fronts. Now, why did it take America so long to get involved? Because this is also a thing with World War II. America does not actually jump on board once all the countries start declaring war on each other in Europe. There's a couple things to it. Namely, America has a foreign policy initiative outside of our hemisphere, obviously, because we still believe in American exceptionalism and imperialism in the Western Hemisphere. Once again, maybe well-intentioned, but also maybe not so much, depending on the leadership and the folks actually involved in it at each different stage. But we believe in staying isolated from the affairs of Europe. Now, we get this idea from none other than our first constitutional president, George Washington, who warned in his farewell address of getting involved in European affairs, being intertwined, or even, as he says, entangled in the affairs of Europe. I think this was a pretty wise idea. And about 50 years later, Monroe actually also, 50 years after the Revolution that is, Monroe writes out his actual Monroe Doctrine in the middle of the 1820s saying that, we're going to stay isolated, our continents, from those of Europe. European empires stay out of the Western Hemisphere. This is the American sphere of influence, meaning our imperial land, the places who will share values with the United States more than with Europe. For better or for worse, we don't really actually defend that until the Spanish-American War, in truth. And it sends a weird message. Here's America as a newer country, relatively new in the 1820s, saying that, Europe, if y'all got a problem with any of the Latin American countries, come to D.C. Come to our capital and we'll deal with it. Leave it to us. And if you also remember, Teddy Roosevelt, the president in the early 1900s, he adds to the Monroe Doctrine with what's called the Roosevelt Corollary. And this corollary, he adds onto it saying, even economic issues, stay out of our hemisphere. And we're going to add Asia onto that too, because maybe Japan's becoming a power, maybe China one day will be a power. We don't want Asian or European countries having any kind of control or exerting control or trying to collect debt from Latin America. You got a problem with Latin America or the United States, you come to Washington, D.C., and the United States will handle it. We are the police, essentially, of the Western Hemisphere, the two North and South American continents. So America is very much isolated from Europe when it comes to actual, military affairs. We're still trading, buku loads of money on it. And America, by 1908, is essentially the number one producer and capable producer of any kind of finished product in the world. So America is thrown with this question and a kind of a paradox of identity and allies on if the country were to join the war, who should we fight with? Right? Here's the stats on it. If we were to ally with the German Empire and their allies called the Central Powers, there's 11 million German Americans who would be kind of okay with that. There's also, a lot, tens of millions of Irish Americans who, frankly, they're like, screw Great Britain. We fled from there. We have no interest in siding with them. So there's a large immigrant population, new immigrant population, who would be a little more happy or amenable, if you will, with America joining the German Empire and the Central Powers. On the flip side of things, there is this undeniable cultural connection and closeness between that of the United States and that of France and England, especially by this time in 1914. All three of these countries have a relative free economy. All three of these countries have shared values of religion and shared values of belief in succeeding on something, and belief in putting in hard work, and belief in freedoms of the press, so on and so forth. So we share a lot of values with them. Plus, let's face it, America and England, we've had this special relationship since right after the Civil War, where we kind of set aside a lot of our differences and agreed that, we're the English-speaking Anglo world. Maybe we should actually work together instead of against each other. Well-intentioned. Now, the actual numbers, when you look at how much money is trading between these two different alliances and the United States, is very interesting. In 1914, on this chart at the bottom, Britain buys from the United States almost $600 million worth of goods. That's a lot. I mean, it doesn't sound like a lot by today's money, but this is 1914 currency. So $600 million, they buy our goods. That's awesome. France also buys $160 million. Not quite as big as what Britain does, but, Britain's Britain, France is France. That's fine. But Germany is the unique wild card here, because Germany in 1914 is also buying $345 million worth of finished products and goods and war materials and everything from the United States. So when the war breaks out, by all means, according to this graph, we're selling to both sides of the conflict. And American businesses, especially those that start to create war materials and weapons and ammunition, they do very well for themselves. They make a lot of money. 1915, Britain almost doubles, and they're like, hey guys, we want to buy like $1 billion worth of stuff from America. Obviously, that's food and weapons, war materials. And France also doubles theirs, more than doubles theirs, to $365 million of exports. Okay, but Germany, look at what Germany does here. Germany goes from having spent $333 million to only $29 million. So they're basically buying from the United States 10% of what they had the year before. So do you see how America is kind of favoring already the allies over the Central Powers? It's there. 1916, the year before America gets involved in the war, then that trend continues. And once again, Britain goes up another $600 million to $1.5 billion U.S. exports purchased. France almost doubles their investment as well. They're buying $628 million now. The war is going on, and it's being a very long conflict. Now, what it finally takes to bring the United States into the Great War is a series of four things. Now, first off, blockades. A blockade is when you actually, literally, like the word says, you block access to something. And in this case, the British and the French were doing this. The British were stopping all German ships going to America, and Britain would also, in some cases, actually try to halt and search ships that were going to Germany or Austria or to the Ottoman Turks from the United States. So both parties are doing this. We don't really like that. America does not like blockades. We like the idea of free oceanic trade. That gets us into trouble later on, too. Secondly, the Lusitania is a cruise ship, and you should be thinking in your head, like, who in their right mind gets on a cruise ship in the middle of an international war? I don't know. These were trying times, and I guess, you need an escape or something.
Confusing times.
Yeah, there's plenty of reasons for it. So in May of 1915, Germany actually posted in newspapers, they made it very open. Hey guys, Americans, don't board the Lusitania. They actually buy a newspaper article like, hey guys, don't get on board the ship. Americans, don't get on it. Because the Germans aren't stupid, per se. They know that the ship is going to sink, and they have a very strong suspicion from their spy agencies that there are war materials illegally shipping on a cruise liner. Now, that changes the dynamic of it, doesn't it? As you probably know, and if you don't, learn it now. The Lusitania is sunk by a German U-boat, an underwater submarine boat, and it's torpedoed. And in a couple minutes, it's sunk. On board, the majority of them die, including 100, almost 30 American civilians. Civilians is the key word, and Americans is the key word here. So this is a British cruise liner with 130 Americans on it for some reason, and it sunk. That's not an international incident. Because, let's face it, if today, say one of our cruise liners leaving, say, Galveston, Texas, were sunk by, a German boat in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico, we'd be kind of ticked off about it. There would be repercussions. There would be something pretty serious, I would imagine. And if it ends up being an even bigger fiasco or creates a pattern, we may actually have gone to war over something like that. Gone to war over this. Foreshadowing. So in this case, the Lusitania is found about 100 years later. This is very recently. I forget the exact date, but it's in 2010 or somewhere around there. The Lusitania is actually found by some of our research vessels, our submarines, in the 21st century. And sure enough, in the hull is war materials, ammunition, mechanized infantry vehicles, so on and so forth. So the Germans were correct. Hey guys, please mute your microphones. Or do I need to do that for you? I shouldn't have to do that, guys. But I will. Mute all. All right. Anywho. So moving on from that. So there is a lot of controversy surrounding Lusitania. All right. Yeah. Bernasia, do you have a question, please? Bernasia, you got your hand up?
Are we supposed to write this down? Anybody in this house?
Well, yeah, I would. I mean, it's notes.
Okay, I'm writing it down.
I gotcha. Okay, moving on. So, like I say, 100 years later, it's found that the Germans were correct. And yeah, America was kind of shady in this, if you think on it. We were trying to sneak weapons. And of course, the United States denies it. So Germany is expected to take the fall for this whole episode. What do they do? Well, they're going to be criticized internationally and especially in the American press. And Germany actually agrees, okay, we're not going to sink any more passenger ships without warning. So we're going to have our submarine come to the surface and be like, hey guys, we're going to search your hull. And if we find weapons, we're going to torpedo it and sink your boat. Otherwise, keep sailing. All right. Now, next up, what ends up happening is Germany adopts a very weird policy, but let me try to explain why they do it. It's not justifying it, but I think it's important that you understand why they adopt this kind of approach. So, understand Germany has never really been an empire who really believes in having a large navy because they weren't into it. They also weren't really into imperialism in Africa. But before World War I breaks out, the policy has kind of changed, and they start to develop a larger, more modern navy. And this is an ongoing thing, but Germany's way behind the curve, even behind the United States, and most certainly behind England at this time. So this is a problem for Germany through World War II. So they're looking for a big bang for their buck. What is the cheapest, most effective combat vessel that you could build in 1914 capable of intimidating, controlling, and scaring the Atlantic Ocean and basically winning battles, or maybe even avoiding them altogether. And they come to the conclusion that the best bang for the buck for their short time frame and small amount of money available is the U-boat, submarines. So they also eventually start implementing a policy that says to their captains, any boat that is obviously shipping things to the Allies, so France or Britain, sink it on sight. And this is not just a few ships. These are hundreds upon hundreds of ships every month. That is not a small number. And unfortunately, they start doing that to America. They stop it temporarily. After Lusitania and after the Maddox boat is also sank, these are passenger ships. But in 1917, Germany is desperate again. And they announce to the world that, hey guys, sorry, but we're going to go back to sinking every boat that's crossing the Atlantic that looks like it's going to Britain or France. Because we can, and you can't really stop us. So, America looks at that kind of distastefully. And that's going to be a heavy kind of push, if you will, for America to enter the war. And then lastly, Germany makes one of the worst calculated mistakes in their country's history. The Zimmermann telegram. Now, telegrams are electric signals that are sent over, sometimes protected in encoded wires, but usually not. You actually have a code locally that kind of separates the letters and mixes things up, and you have to decipher it on the other end. In this case, ciphers were actually able to decode this message that was sent from Germany to Mexico, a country directly to our south. So, in the letter, to kind of paraphrase it, Germany is offering Mexico money in response, and what they expect in return is that Mexico is going to use that money and the war materials to invade the United States and go after the so-called Las Provincias Perdidas. I guess it's Las Provincias Perdidas, the lost provinces of Texas all the way to California, the stuff that Mexico lost, at this point about 70 years earlier in the Mexican-American War. Now, of course, Mexico looks at that and they're like, no, no, we're not going to declare war on the United States. No, that ain't going to happen. just imagine the fiasco. This is like a next door neighbor who, yeah, you've had some questionable history with, but you're also both dependent on. Like, why would Mexico ever invade the United States like that? So Mexico, of course, looks at it and just returns as like, no, thank you. But the telegram, because it is intercepted, is leaked to the public. And the public gets a hold of this through the newspapers. And you can kind of imagine during the time of yellow journalism, once again, exaggerations and sometimes even outright untruths, or I'll be brave enough to go on and say outright lies put into the presses here on a lot of the stories and exaggerations, to the point to where even German Americans are like, what on earth? Germany, motherland, why would you do something like that? At that point, you're no longer just a German American. German becomes, if you will, an adjective. And the American part after the hyphen becomes the noun. We're all Americans at this time. So this actually unifies a lot of the demographics and the different subpopulations who were kind of on the fence on should we get involved or should we not get involved. And now everyone's like, heck yes, Mexico, that's our hemisphere. That's our trade partner. That's our neighbor. You don't try to screw with that relationship. So for Germany, there you go. The writing's on the wall. Sure enough, the U.S. Congress is going to vote by a pretty hefty margin of 373 to 50 between the two houses for a joint resolution. So there you go. We're going to go on and go to war. Now, this gets tricky because the president at the time, Woodrow Wilson, had actually won re-election in 1916, just a year before we're declaring war. And his platform said, if y'all remember from your reading, that he kept us out of war. And here we are a year later, and we're declaring war. So it's like, oops, broken promise, I guess. Stuff happens. So Wilson now has the need to go and actually sell the war, if you will, convince the people this is a worthy endeavor, and this is worth the extra money and the new taxes that we're going to be charging, and so on and so forth. And he also has to convince those 50 who voted against it that it's still a good endeavor also. So how's he going to do it? We'll get to that. Now, while America is during the war, there was a major ally, France and Britain, Russia, who left the war. So to keep it brief, there is a guy who was thrown into a prison in Europe. And this guy was thrown in prison because he was trying to stage a coup or a takeover of the Russian government. And, let's face it, the royal families are all like cousins of each other at this time. So you try to screw over one of them, the whole family knows, and it's a family ordeal. It's kind of like organized crime if you think on it. So they're going to put this guy, Vladimir Lenin, in prison. In 1917, Germany actually releases Vladimir Lenin and gives him a trainload of gold and sends him into Russia. And they tell him, hey, take all this money here and start your revolution. Now, why do they do that? They do that to intentionally cause a communist revolution, a distraction from World War I for the entire Russian country. So this is most certainly, the first time we see a communist take over. And oddly enough, just to kind of put it in historical context, this is also, it's completely avoidable. But the Germans are desperate, very desperate. They need to stop fighting on both fronts. They can't keep fighting on the West and the East. They want to just fight on the West. So they get Russia out of the war. The communist revolution works. Russia pays some money to Germany, and they're like, hey, leave us alone. We surrender. We're out of the war. Let us deal with our own new communist system. Why not, right? So Russia leaves in 1917. America joins in 1917. Convenient, if you will, for the Allies. And the Allies themselves, especially Britain, was very thankful and probably very desperate to get America involved. And they'll be desperate also in 1941 to get America involved in World War II, kind of foreshadowing there. This leads to an international moment in America we call the First Red Scare, where people are like, hang on, if this communist takeover works, are they going to come to America next? Are they going to take over our government and our society and our economy, most importantly? So it leads to a lot of social questions and changes. But to get the American people on board with the war, you got to throw out that propaganda. Here's two examples. Gee, I wish I were a man. I'd join the Navy. Be a man and do it. United States Navy recruiting station. They're like really patriotic, very sharp to the point. They're trying to convince you, and maybe in some would say even like coerce you into believing or thinking a certain way or saying something even. Another one over here. The first call, I need you in the Navy this minute. Our country will always be proudest of those who answered the first call. Our country will be proudest. Interesting. Very interesting words. So these propaganda posters, if you think on them, they have a couple of like draws to them. They're flashy. They're catchy. They kind of like make you question, like, what are you doing to help the war effort? And we see, especially in the Second World War, there's a lot who would actually look at this kind of national propaganda and this super nationalism and think, if the man in the couple is like not willing to go fight for his country, he's probably not willing to fight for the lady of the house. So there's a lot of relationships actually torn up over this stuff too. So he continues, and he's trying to write out, Woodrow Wilson is, he's trying to write out a message that can gain traction and get people to buy in. So he goes to the public and he's like, okay, guys, if we get involved with this war and we win it and we invest all the money and, the death of our young for this war, and we put everything that we can into it and we win it, this could be a war to end all future wars. And that sounds pretty powerful if you're honest with yourself. This is a pretty big thing. He's then going to go on also to Congress and actually put the point out there. It's like, you know what? This could be a war that, if we win, would make the world safe for democracy. So now it's like, oh, we're going to get involved in this war to help out like our belief in political systems. We want every country to have what America has, to have the right to choose their leadership and their votes actually count and matter. Okay, that's... again, that's not necessarily a bad thing when you think on it at the surface. Well, certainly not a bad thing. A little side story here. 1914 Christmas on the Western Front. So these folks are in the trenches that we've talked about, and both sides are kind of like disillusioned. There was a lot of nationalistic belief the war would be over by Christmas, and obviously that didn't happen. So for one night, there's a truce reached, and the Germans and the French, and I think also some of the British in this particular battle, they would actually come out of their trenches and share what food and cigarettes and liquor and whatever else they had, and just have a little Christmas celebration there in the middle of the battlefield. Kind of a neat moment in history. Yeah, James, you got a question?
Kind of. It kind of sounds kind of weird once that Christmas is over. You have to go back to killing each other.
Please, Josh.
There's actually a really sad song. I forget who wrote it, but I know Celtic Thunder, a group of like four tenors, they sing it, and y'all can look it up on YouTube sometime, and we'll probably watch it at Christmas in class also. But they sing about how, like, sure enough, there was like a young choir boy, because the Germans would recruit kids, like younger than y'all. We're talking like 14 to 18 would be easily brought in. Kids could lie about their age, and there's no way to verify it. Be like, yeah, sure, I'm 15. Yeah, I'm 15, just haven't hit puberty yet. And they'll go and actually allow you into the army. The Germans they wanted to build, mute you again, James got a lot of background noise. They wanted to have as big an army as possible. And they didn't really care how they got to those large numbers. That's just what the Germans wanted. So Woodrow Wilson, to his credit, and a well-intentioned idea again, he is going to develop what he calls the 14 points. And these are 14 points to kind of set up the world for future peace and avoid massive conflict. A lot of these are pretty good ideas. Some of them include the ideas of freedom of the seas, the idea that, if you're a merchant vessel, you shouldn't have to fear like being attacked by some foreign country. If your country enters into a military alliance, it should be publicly known and like available knowledge to kind of like also deter future warfare. Because if you know that like a bully on the playground has like 20 friends with him, you're gonna make sure that you come also with like 21 friends or something, right? It's a needed calculation that you need to know. It's a variable you need to know. Also, this idea that countries could choose their own type of government. We call that self-determinationism. That's a word that's going to be kind of prevalent throughout the 20th century in American history. So these are well-intentioned ideas. And the chief aim that he felt was going to bring all this together and make it possible was a body of international leaders who would come together, meet, talk, and discuss things, and if need be, figure out a way to avoid conflicts. He called that the League of Nations. So in the end, the 14 points is basically the only thing that actually gets passed. Now, Woodrow Wilson, kind of like a sidestep here, just I'll cover it real quick for you. Woodrow Wilson makes a terrible decision and doesn't bring a single Republican with him when he goes to Paris after the war to negotiate the end of the war treaty. Now, that matters because at this time the Senate is held by Republicans. And let's face it, if any president, like say, people learn from Woodrow Wilson's mistake, because like since then every president has always made sure to have delegations sent to compromises and treaty events and whatnot, people from both parties, so that both parties sign on to and agree with it. They learn from the mistake. But Woodrow Wilson went himself and becomes the only president to stay out of country for that long ever in American history. And he's trying to lead the negotiation themselves. And the Allies, they come with their own agenda. They want to punish Germany no matter what, to gross amounts. So the League of Nations is the only thing that really passes. And the irony here, is that the League of Nations is the American idea, and America does not join the League of Nations. Why we don't join that? Because the Senate feels, and a lot of the American public agrees with this, we're tired of being involved in this European war. We're tired of it. We want to go back to normalcy, to isolationism, to America First ideology. We want to go back to how things were, 10 years, 15 years earlier. That was the public desire at the time. And on top of this, there is a really big fear of a lot of senators who look at the Treaty of Versailles, and especially at the League of Nations Charter, and they're like, well, hang on. If we actually join this organization, the United States is surrendering our sovereignty in matters of war. Fancy words for if 10 countries in the world go to war, then America is going to be forced to join too. And we don't like being forced to do anything. We like choices. And especially when it comes to our country. We don't like some other country having any control over us. So, in your notes here, one of the key issues, the League of Nations and why it doesn't actually pass in the United States and we don't join it, is because there was a legitimate fear that other countries were now going to be controlling the United States at some level. We didn't like that. Now, the U.S. is still going to help out with the war effort. Even when we're joining and we're trying to figure out, how to do basic training, get as many troops out there, and we draft through what's called selective services, we're still sending and packaging, producing hundreds of tons of food. We're sending cheap loans of sometimes even free money to our allies. We are sending over fresh troops of what we call the American Doughboy Army, the American Expeditionary Force, the AEF. So this is, America is basically the breadbasket of the world this time for the Allied powers. How does the country change because of this war? Well, namely, women will actually, and this is not new for women to go out and get jobs. What is new about it is the volume of women who go out and get jobs in the industry sector. They are filling the holes left behind by the men who are being drafted into military services. So this is a first time that we see this many women not just going to work, but going to work in traditionally male-dominated fields, such as industry. And that will, of course, lead to women, when they pursue the vote again after World War I, they get it. And then the African-American population. Now black soldiers, especially what was called in the Spanish-American War the Buffalo Soldiers, they are joining in the World War I and fighting segregated units. And the Harlem Hellfighters are notoriously famous for just outstanding achievements on the battlefield. So there's a lot of proof that black soldiers are just as capable, if not even more capable, than the white predominated numbers inside the armed forces. Now, this isn't necessarily so important now, but think foreshadowing into World War II. There was an actual U.S. government document that says in the flight manual that black people could not see at night. So they could never be pilots. They could never be soldiers who would have night duties. And that's a pretty serious handicap. Now, as you probably know, that's like complete BS. We know this is a lie. Nonetheless, that was the actual scientific, I use that word loosely, but they thought it was scientific fact at the time. During World War I also, we see a lot of the black populations leaving the sharecropping plantations essentially of the South, and they're moving north, and they're moving west into cities. We call this massive migration the Great Migration. Now, during the war, the United States government is very much concerned on how the people are reacting to the war and what they're saying about it, how they're thinking about it. So people hate German things. They start, like changing different names, and so like sauerkraut becomes Liberty cabbage. And we did this again 100 years later with the Iran-Iraq War, and then also well into the 21st century with the Iraq and the Gulf War too. When France was actually seen to be openly negotiating with terrorists and, like not really siding with America and Britain on our like anti-terrorist stance in the war on terror, there were actually restaurants, like even McDonald's, who changed the name of French fries to Freedom Fries. This is like, when y'all are very young, very, very young for some of y'all, we're actually like going into McDonald's and be like, yeah, I like a cheeseburger with Freedom Fries. It just sounds weird, right? But it was an actual thing. And 2 laws are passed that are very questionable and very much go against the First Amendment. Nonetheless, we get scared and desperate during times of war. So the Espionage Act and the Sedition Acts, together these 2 laws create an atmosphere where if you talk out against the country, if you talk out against freedoms, if you talk out against capitalism, you talk against republic or democracy, you're going to be kind of looked at differently, and the government may actually put you in jail, and people would be put in jail. So what ends the war? The 1919 Versailles Treaty. I would argue this is probably the worst treaty period ever in human history. It does not solve anything. All it does is sound like a bunch of kindergartners fighting. It's her fault, so make her pay for it. That's all the Versailles Treaty does, is it places blame on Germany, forces Germany to pay what's called war reparations back to the French and the British. The North African states are kind of like tossed aside with what's called the mandate system, and this is where a lot of hatred from the Arab populations towards the West, especially America and Britain, come from, because we broke promises. We had promised the Arabs that if they help us defeat the Ottoman Turks and win in World War I, we would allow them to set up their own boundaries, and they can, self-determinationism. They can choose their own government. We did not follow through on that promise, and America didn't really do anything to stop Britain from being really, really savage with what they do after World War I here. So that's where a lot of that animosity comes from as well. On the side note here, Germany is expected to pay this exorbitant amount of money, billions upon billions of dollars of today's currency. But we strip their country of any material wealth. We take away their richest land and we give it to France. Alsace and Lorraine, gone. Yeah, James, you got a question?
Yeah, so basically they gave them a bunch of loads of debt and no way to actually pay it.
Kind of like a debtor's prison. If you put someone in prison, in a debtor's prison, because they can't pay back their bill or something, how on earth are they supposed to make money while they're sitting in prison?
Exactly.
It's like you can't do it, right? It's not possible. Very good question there, James. Thank you. So yeah, this is a pretty serious issue, and America during the 1920s would see that, and they would actually negotiate some different relief bills for Germany. Not enough, because Britain and France actually take all that money and they just continue doing what they will. Another aspect of the Versailles Treaty is we set these quotas on military sizes, including navies. And obviously when Adolf Hitler comes to power, he ignores all that. So that is America's involvement in World War I in a nutshell.